Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for tuning into the cloudnative.fm podcast. You are listening to the host Saim, the co-founder of Cloud Native Islamabad community and organizer of the very first KCD Pakistan. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, regardless of where you are and watching or listening to me or watching or listening to the recording. Very warm welcome to the show. A show which brings in the latest and greatest news from the cloud native CNCF ecosystem to help you keep up to speed with what's going on, where you need to be focused on more, where you meet the brave mind and awesome community members, co-founder of the most watched open source project. And today is April 6th, and I am joined by MVP and the author of Azure Container Explained book. On this debate, the cloud native approach to building and running software was pioneered by a group of companies commonly referred to as the born in the cloud. Cloud native development incorporates the concepts of DevOps, continuous delivery, microservices, and container. This episode walks you through a scenario of taking an existing application and migrating it over to use a cloud native approach in order to take advantage of increased scalability and higher level services. We are delighted to share we are joined by Azure and Cloud Native expert Richard Hooper, aka Pixel Report, to demonstrate how to best use DevOps principle to manage the building, testing, and deployment of the application lifecycle on Azure using the latest cloud native tooling. Learn how to build cloud native application with a breadth of developer services from Azure, including Azure Function, Azure Kubernetes Services, developer productivity tool like VS Code, Terraform, and some monitoring tool. So without further delay, let me go straight to my guest today, Richard Hooper. Thank you very much for joining us today on the podcast. Now, give us your intro of yourself and then we start the proceeding.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me for a start. That was a great introduction. So my name is Richard Hooper, also known as Pixel Robots Online. I'm based in the UK, Azure MVP, with a massive focus on containers, cloud native technology, and AKS. And as you said, author of a book, Azure Containers Explained, which I have a copy right here. Definitely really like this book, obviously, because I co-wrote it with my colleague Wesley Hackman. So yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Richard. So without any further delay, let's start the screen and we're discussing what we're covering today. So over to you now.
Yeah, cool. So let's talk about AKS. I've already introduced myself, but I'll put some little notes on the screen so you can see. You can find me on Twitter at Pixel Robots and my blog pixelrobots.co.uk. Haven't done much blogging lately. I need to get that spark back. So hopefully soon we'll see some more blog posts coming up, which will be awesome. I don't really like slides. So with that, I'm going to go straight into a demo because, yeah, slides take time to create and everyone gets bored of slides. So let's just sort of switch over to the Azure portal, one of my favorite places, which I don't actually use as much as I should do anymore because I'm doing everything through infrastructure as code or the Azure CLI. So you sort of don't really see the portal as much anymore. But it's there. It's good. It's a good sort of place to go if you're learning new things with Azure and the cloud native world. So here we have the Azure portal. It's Kubernetes services. So at the top, I just searched for Kubernetes services, and then I get a list of the current Kubernetes clusters I have. I have one called AKS Helm Check, which is currently off, and I have an Azure Arc enabled one, which is actually running Azure Kubernetes services on my laptop with the AKS Edge Essentials new system, which is like a hybrid version. So it's running in like a Hyper-V instance on my laptop, and then I'm using Azure Arc to inject it into Azure so I can then manage it with all the cloud native tooling that you get with Azure. So like Azure Policy, which uses OPA, Gatekeeper, and stuff like that. So what I was thinking in this course, or in this talk really, is let's have a little look at building a AKS cluster, some best practices, because we need that foundation to know where to host all of our applications and get that sort of journey started. So what we would do, and or if there's any questions, please feel free to jump in, ask anything as well. We can stop at any point. So here at the top, we would hit create. We have the create a Kubernetes cluster option, add a Kubernetes cluster with Azure Arc or create an AKS hybrid cluster, which is in preview. For this, we're just going to create a Kubernetes cluster. And then hopefully, if Azure and my internet work, we have the standard window you're used to seeing straight away, which talks about your subscription selection. So for this, I haven't got much money left on my MVP sponsorship. I've been spending too much on AKS, so I'm just going to pick my MSDN one. And I'm going to create a new resource group, and we'll call this RG-Cloud Native Podcast, if I spell that right. No, cats. I've got cats on the brain. Cast like that, yeah. So I'm just going to copy this as well because I want that later. And for this, someone's ringing me on Teams. Let me just cancel Teams because we don't want that going off again. Quit that. Cool. So yeah, sorry about that. So here we got cluster presets. So AKS Azure's decided these are some nice presets you can set. So when you are deploying your cluster and you're new to it, you can use one of these presets so you get the best practices or some of the best practices to ensure your cluster is as operational as possible. So we got the standard one, which is usually good for production ready scenarios. It misses a few marks in my opinion, but it's a good one to start off with. And then you got your dev test, which is perfect for development purposes, testing purposes, very basic B series VMs and stuff. Cost optimize, which is, yeah, basically, if you don't care about the cluster being up all the time, use this, and you really want to get the cheap cost, definitely go for that one. And then we got batch processing. So this is very high intense compute, graphics as well. And this costs a lot of money, which you can see from the $3 signs. So for this, we're just going to go with the standard one as a base. Next, we're going to give it the name. And we're just going to call it Cloud Native Podcast. We can call it anything we want. And because I'm in the UK, I'm just going to pick one of my UK regions, which I will do UK South. Hopefully there's capacity. Next, we have the availability zone. So this is very important in Azure because if you've got your application running in AKS and you've got it set up with HA, high availability, it's a production-ready system. You don't want downtime. In Azure, you have regions, and in each region, you have availability zones, which are basically data centers with their own separate cooling, separate power, and so forth. So zone 1, 2, and 3 are technically different data centers in an Azure region. There could actually be multiple data centers, but we always use zones 1, 2, and 3. So by saying I want to use zone 1, 2, and 3, we're having our control plane, our nodes spread over those different availability zones. If one zone went down because there was a cooling issue or a power issue, my cluster is still going to be up and running because at least the other nodes are running in the other availability zone. So that's definitely very important to make sure you're spreading your load out as much as possible. You can actually configure your applications to take advantage of the availability zones by using topology skews. So you can say this one goes to this zone, this one goes to that zone without having to do much inside your Kubernetes manifest file, which is really nice. It's sort of there out of the box, and I really like it. It's not used as much as it should be. Not many people seem to know about it. Next up, we have the AKS pricing tier. So there's been a lot of talk about this recently because it used to be called paid and free, and then Azure changed the name to standard and free. So everyone thought, oh, there's a new free tier for AKS, but that's not actually a real thing. In AKS, you just don't get charged for the control plane. That's always free unless you pay for the standard one. And that is basically just giving you the uptime SLA of 99.95. With the free one, you don't get an uptime SLA. And it also sort of brings to you the control plane sort of scaling as well. So when you're working in a production ready system and you're going to have lots of nodes, more than 10, definitely go for the standard one. It is also financially backed with the SLA. So definitely worth going for. This one, the free one, perfect for dev, test, and stuff like that. So we'll leave that as free. It's part of the standard process. Then we have the Kubernetes version, which is also near enough matching the actual vanilla Kubernetes version. So we will have 126 in public in GA in the world of Kubernetes. So you're running it locally. But in Azure, we have it as preview currently. It will hopefully come out of preview very soon. Azure is one of the sort of first cloud providers who actually has the new version. So like if you're looking at GKE or EKS, so Amazon, Google, you'll probably find they're still on maybe 124 and not even 125 now. So Azure is one of those ones where you always get the latest and greatest as quick as possible. And their version of Kubernetes is as vanilla as possible, in my opinion, and also in the Azure opinion. You get things like the AWS version where they've made changes to Kubernetes, which hasn't been pushed back to the open source community. So there's things where they could have, if you're using like a feature to encrypt all your secrets in your etcd, then AWS's version, you can do a lot more than Azure's, but Azure's version is the open source version. They've created the code, they've pushed it back to the Kubernetes master branch, to the actual Kubernetes community, and they're working on that, and they're always giving back, which is really nice to see. So if it works in Azure, it'll work in all the other clouds because they're giving it back to Kubernetes, which I really, really like, and not every cloud provider is doing that. So yeah. And another cool feature, which is quite new, is this automatic upgrade, which is relatively new in the world of Azure. We've got quite a few different options now, and it's always recommended to enable it with just the patching. So it just do the patch version. So the last bit, so like 124 point patch, and it will automatically keep that up to date. But be careful, because if you're running your applications with, say, one replica or without the topology skew, so they're not over the different availability zones, if you're updating the patch version, it's going to rule the nodes and give you new versions. So that means your app could actually cause downtime. So definitely keep an eye on this setting and make sure you only enable it if you have multiple replicas of your application running spread over different nodes. Otherwise, you could face downtime. But saying that, they've thought of a scenario where you might only have one, but you would have a maintenance window. So there's actually ways to do scheduled maintenance with AKS as well. So say at the weekend, you are okay for a bit of downtime. So you can set that schedule. You can enable the automatic upgrades, and then it will just do that for you in your out of hours maintenance window, which is really cool. Just be very careful with the API versions of your Kubernetes manifest, because if you're upgrading, say, from 124 to 125, there might be an API depreciation in your code. So that means once it does the update, your app might not start because you've got the wrong API version currently running. So always keep an eye on that as well. And then next up, we just got node size. So this is a DS2 v2 standard one. We'll just leave it at that. And I'm just going to set this down to 1 for now. In production, you want at least 3 and leave it to auto scale, but I'm running low on costs, so I'm just going to set it to 1. Next up, we have node pools. So everyone knows what node pool is, hopefully in Kubernetes, but it's a collection of nodes which are the same sort of size, where you can put all of your workloads on. So you can have different ones for different types of workloads. You can have a Windows one, a Linux one. In Azure, we have the concept of system node pools, where all of your system resources go. So like core DNS and stuff like that. And then you can have worker node pools, like user node pools, I think they're called. So we can just set all of that up here. We also have a cool feature called virtual nodes, which uses Azure Container instances to do bursting. So if you have some application there, it's going to burst quickly, you can use Azure Container instances, so you don't need to spin up new nodes, and it can just do that. You pay per second with that as well instead of per hour. And obviously we've got the standard Node OS encryption. For this, we're just going to use encryption at rest with platform managed keys, but we can bring our own custom managed keys and link it to a key vault. Next up, we have access. So access is very, very important when you're working with Kubernetes and your applications and stuff, because you don't want anyone to be able to access your systems. You want to make sure you lock it down. So by default, and this is one feature I really hate, is it's always enabling the local accounts with Kubernetes RBAC. Now, the local account is a global cluster admin, basically, inside the AKS cluster, inside the Kubernetes cluster, which has God mode to the whole cluster. So the default option is to leave that enabled, which to me is really bad. Now, I would rather use one of these two options. So I can use my Azure AD authentication, which brings me multi-factor authentication as well. And then if I need super granularity on the role-based access control, I'd use Kubernetes. If not, I would use Azure RBAC, where you can actually scope it down to the namespace, and you can manage it all through the Azure role-based access control system from there. So it's like a single pane of glass for your role-based access control inside Kubernetes. So for this one, I'm just going to use this one here. And then we need to add an Azure AD group. So we'll just click on this one and I'll find one of my many groups, AKS admin, which I know I'm already a member of. I believe, hopefully, we'll soon find out. And then, yeah, we just click next on that one. So this is going to go off and create some managed identities and stuff in the background. Next up, we have networking, which is very important to get right when you're doing all of your applications and building this cloud native platform. So Azure has a few options now. In the Azure portal, you only see Kubernetes or Azure CNI, but there is a new feature where you can bring your own CNI. So you can bring the likes of Cilium, Calico, and actually take advantage of all these cool cloud native features that you may need to run your application. And there's also a new offering called Azure CNI powered by Cilium or something like that is the name. But it's like a hosted Cilium that Microsoft will manage for you, give you support on it. It's not as feature rich as the open source Cilium one or the enterprise Cilium one that you could bring, but it's there and it's good to know about. So for this, we could just click Azure CNI, and with Azure CNI, we notice that it's going to use IP addresses in a VNet. So every pod in your cluster will get an IP address. So every possible pod as well, not every pod, so every possible pod. So each node by default could have 30 pods running or 110 pods, depending on how you're creating it. So your IP subnet needs to have enough IPs for all possible pods running on that node. And then when you're doing the update, it needs to have the IPs available to add a new node or however many nodes you do, depending on how you surge it to do the update. So very, very important to get that right. Now, there is a new feature as well called Azure CNI Overlay, which gives you a software-defined networking, but the benefits of Azure CNI. So like Kubernetes only works with Linux. Azure CNI works with Windows and Linux. So if you've got some Windows containers, then definitely look at that. So for this one, we're just going to use the default options, and hopefully I got it all right. But it just creates us a virtual network, a subnet, and some IP ranges for the services inside.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, good. So there are a few questions I think we can address right now. One of them is, I think, from Sajid. Is can you deploy across region?
So you can't deploy a Kubernetes cluster across region, but you can deploy multiple Kubernetes clusters to different regions. And then there's this feature in AKS called Kubernetes Fleet Manager. I think if I just search up here and we do Kubernetes Fleet Manager. And this tool is like an entry point into all your clusters. So you can attach as many clusters as you want to it over different regions. And you talk to this fleet manager, and then it can say, if you want to deploy to all your dev clusters, it will say, right, this is my group of dev clusters, and I'll go deploy stuff to this. I'll do updates to this. And then production, it will go into the fleet manager and then go down to there. It can even have like a global load balancer in it. So you can actually have your services point to your fleet, and then it will distribute it between the other ones. So it's a new feature. It's been in preview about 6-7 months or so, maybe a bit longer, and it's got constant development on it. So definitely look at it. I believe we're even going to hear about it at KubeCon. So we've got an Azure Kubernetes Day, and there's going to be some talk about that as well. So it's going to be quite good to see that grow, and I'm quite excited for it because it could make life a lot easier when you've got hundreds of clusters, or even tens of clusters to look after, and then it will help with that DR and sort of availability across regions in Azure, which is really good to see.
Yes. So one more question from Nick. How would you set up the topology skew? How do we know which API version of the manifest match which AKS version?
Cool. Good question, Nick. So the topology skew is in your Kubernetes manifest file for your deployment or your stateful set or your daemon set. There's a few lines of code you need to put into there. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head. But if you just look for topology skew Kubernetes manifest, you'll find it in Google, and you just sort of add that in there. And then for your other one, there's this really cool tool called KubePug. So it's like a pug dog, like a puppy thing. And you put it on your computer, it runs on Windows and Linux, which is really cool. And then you just tell it, you connect to your cluster, you run kubepug and tell it what version you want to go to. It will scan your cluster and give you a list of any any APIs or manifests or resources that you've got on your cluster that won't work with that new version. So I always run that before I do any updates on my AKS cluster. If you're doing the update via the portal, it will also tell you that there are API depreciations, but it won't tell you what resources yet. I would love to see that feature come in, and I think it's on the AKS roadmap, so we might have that one day. So before you actually do the update, it will say, you need to go and update these resources because they're not compatible with the new version. So hopefully we'll see it natively to Azure, but for now I use kubepug.
Yes, thank you, Richard. We can go ahead and...
Cool. Okay, awesome. So yeah, we'll just use these basic IP configurations. We're going to use a standard load balancer. That's the only option you have now. They should probably remove this, but it's okay for now. And then you can use a private cluster, but we're not going to do that for now. But basically, a private cluster means the Kubernetes API, the bit when you type kubectl, what it talks to isn't available on the whole internet. But yeah, they also have this other feature called set authorized IP ranges. So you can actually just give your IP address inside it rather than having it just private. So you have to be via Bastion, via VPN, into a VNet and all of that stuff. So it depends on your security requirements. The authorized IP ranges can be absolutely fine for what your needs. It's quite good for when you're using hosted agents and stuff like that with Azure DevOps and stuff. But a lot of security people really want this private cluster, but it doesn't give you much difference to the set authorized IP ranges. So it's totally up to you. And then we have network policies. So we can have Calico or Azure. So Calico, obviously, we all know about Calico. It's a nice company, nice product by Tegera, I think is how you say their name. And these network policies, if you think of them, it's kind of like firewall access control lists. So you can set this set of pods can only talk to this set of pods, or this namespace can only talk to this namespace, and just control it that way. The good thing with Calico ones is you can set global policies, so over the whole cluster. But you only get support via the open source community via Slack, I think it is Slack. And then the Azure one, you get support via Azure, but you can't do global policies. So my best practice is to go for the Calico ones. But again, it all depends if you want that open source support and you want global policies, or if you just want the Azure ones. Back in the day, the Azure ones wouldn't support Windows, Calico would, but now they both do. So that's all good. So for this now, it's just a demo. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Jeff, small question on this side. So do we see a support for Cilium network policies in future?
I think they will be coming, yes. If you bring your own CNI, then they're going to be there. But with the Azure CNI powered by Cilium, I think we will see it. It's not there yet, but I really do hope we do see it, because I love they've got this really cool website where you can actually use a GUI to build your policies, and it's so helpful. I use it when I build my Calico ones because it's very similar and you can just tweak it a bit. So yeah, I hope it does come. Cilium's doing some wonderful things with eBPF and everything, so I'm excited to see what comes of that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. And you can search for Cilium editor on the internet and you can find this editor.
Yeah. Cool. So we're just going to leave it as none for now because there's no need for it. So I've already enabled Defender for Cloud in my whole subscription because that's one of my best practices, to always enable it in your subscription. But this will give me runtime protection, vulnerability scanning on my containers and stuff like that. So it's really cool. It's powered by Falco as well in the back end. It's all managed by Azure. So you've got your single pane of glass, which makes management so much easier. Now we could attach a container registry. I haven't got any, but I'm not going to create one here. But this container registry is kind of like a Docker hub, but for you. So it's your Azure Container Registry. You can have it public if you want to. You can have it private. You can link it via private link to your AKS cluster. You can create only certain people can access it and do some crazy stuff. So yeah, look at that if you're going to use it. And then container logs. So obviously you've got a cluster, you need to manage it. You need to know what's happening with your applications. You need somewhere to put all of this metrics. And Azure's out-of-the-box system is Azure Container Insights, and it uses a log analytics workspace to put in. Now, if you're using another third-party tool, say like Datadog or some other tool to monitor it, like Grafana, Prometheus, you don't need this. But Microsoft recommend you put it on if you haven't got any other tools. So for now, we're just going to leave it on. And then we have this cool new feature which came out recently called alerting. So by default, it's actually going to enable some recommended alerts for you, like CPU percentage, memory, and it's going to email me straight away and let me know, right, there's an issue here, go and sort it. Otherwise, you'd have to go configure these alerts yourself and everything. So it's nice to see that they do it out of the box now. And then we can link in with managed identity to the log analytics workspace. Otherwise, it uses different tools, but that's still in preview. So for now, I'm just going to untick it. Next up, we have Azure Policy. And for some reason, and I don't know why I keep asking, but the standard best practice preset thing is to not enable it. Whereas for me, I would always enable it because it doesn't cause any issues to have it enabled. But what it does is lets you use like Open Policy Agent and gatekeeper policies, what's the word? I can't remember. But basically,
Rago.
That's it. Thank you very much. Policies, but via Azure management pane. So you can actually go in there, create your own policies, and it will synchronize them about every 45 minutes down into the AKS cluster. So if you've got a nice Azure environment and you care about your governance, which you should do, most of your stuff is done via Azure Policy. With this, you can use that Azure Policy to bring it down into your cluster as well. So again, that single pane of glass, which is what every admin wants, because they don't want to be flicking between hundreds of different tools to find out what's going wrong and to secure stuff. So I always enable that. Even if I don't use it straight away, I always enable it.
Next yes, and just a small question on the policy side. Let's say if somebody want to bring in Kyverno and Opa Gatekeeper. So is it available as of today, or is it in the planning phase, or what the strategy those for people who are actually using Kyverno or Opa?
Okay, so this is actually using Opa in the background and Gatekeeper in the background. So you don't have to manage it. Azure will manage it for you. If you want to bring your own, you can just disable Azure Policy and bring your own. You can bring whatever policy management software you want. As long as it works in Kubernetes, it will work in here. We've got the new, policy admission stuff that's just coming out in 1.27, I think.
Yes, Kubernetes validation WAP.
There we go. Yep, that.
Yes.
Yeah, so you could even use that if you wanted to. I don't think it does any mutations, but yeah, it's whichever one you want, it will support it. So it's good to go. But if you're like me, you live in Azure, you want to do everything in Azure, you would use Azure Policy, which uses OPA and Gatekeeper in the back end, and I don't need to manage it because I'm a lazy administrator, to be honest. I don't want to go and update all my applications constantly. I want someone else to do it for me, and Microsoft will. And like even here on the advanced section, we got the secret store CSI driver. I could tick a box. This will install this secret store driver package, CSI, into my cluster, manage it for me, and it means I can inject secrets from Azure Key Vault into my pods. And I just have to tick a box to enable it. I don't have to go helm install and do all of that stuff. So that's really cool. But for now, I'm just going to leave that off for now. And then this here is just the infrastructure resource group. So this is a standard one that Microsoft will give you. You can change it to any resource group name you have, so it matches your systems and stuff like that. And then next up, we have tags. So always tag your Azure stuff. So in here, I can just pick one of my many tags or just call it anything I want. Name, cluster, it doesn't matter. Literally anything, something that's relevant to you. And then we can click review and create. It will go through all my validation, or all of my input I've just given it, tick the validation, and then hopefully we'll get a green tick and we can actually deploy it, which we have. So validation has passed. We can hit create. And what this does in the back end is talk to the Azure ARM APIs and does a deployment. So it's sort of using a sort of ARM template that is created for me, which looks like a lot of JSON. And just by filling in all those stuff, it creates all that for me, and we can just wait and watch that work, which would be good because it's going to create me a VNet, it's going to create me a subnet, the AKS cluster, and all of that fun stuff. So that sort of gives you that nice foundation. But don't ever do a production one via the portal. Use infrastructure as code. So you get a lot more options when you're doing it through infrastructure as code. You can actually adjust the scheduler properties. You can adjust some bits on the nodes. You can enable extra features like Kida, which we'll talk about in a second. You can enable workload identity. You can't do any of that via the Azure portal. So really, the Azure portal is good for dev tests, or if you're learning and you just want to try something new. So yeah, I've just shown it here because it's easier to show in a demo rather than going through hundreds of lines of ARM templates or bicep files or Terraform. It's just a nicer demo to see. So this can take about 6 minutes or so to deploy.
Okay, so Richard, yes, absolutely. So Richard, just while it's happening in the background, can we ask some few questions here? It's like sometime like we know there's a Kubernetes as a control plane, that worker node control plane as scheduler, API server, all these components. So if somebody like remember in the cloud, we don't see a control plane. With the control plane is hide from us, and we just end up working with the worker node as of today. But is there an option for people somehow, like they want to still use the AKS cluster, but they need a full access to the control plane component as well? So if can you direct them people, if that is actually a use case for some of the people, what are the best service available in Azure?
So if you want access to the control plane, you cannot use the hosted version of AKS. You could build a lot of VMs and then put AKS onto it using kubeadm or whatever tool you want to build it. And then you can onboard that cluster, as long as it's a CNCF certified cluster, you can then onboard that to Azure Arc using the Azure Arc tooling and then manage it from Azure. So you can have that cluster running in AWS or Google Cloud, and you can onboard it into Azure and then use the Azure management plane to look after those clusters. So you could run in VMs in Azure, you could run in VMs in AWS, you could run it on I run one on my laptop and I have that injected into Azure. I got Raspberry Pis over on my shelf, which runs AKS. So I think that now Azure Arc now lets you do ARM-based ones, so I can put that into Azure. So literally anywhere you want to run Kubernetes in a certified cluster, then Azure can look after it, which is really cool.
Yes, well, absolutely. So one more question on the same line, like, there's this vulnerability scanners in the market, and there are quite a few of them in there. So let's say if somebody using the AWS in let's say Azure, and they want to scan the images inside the CI/CD pipeline, or they want a scanner and they want to use Azure for that. So what is the service for scanning the images?
So we have Azure or Microsoft Defender for Containers, which is part of the Microsoft Defender for Cloud suite, can actually scan your containers during the pipeline. So if you're using GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps, you can actually inject it into there. I think you can do it with Azure DevOps, 100% with GitHub Actions. And or if you've got your containers built into Azure Container Registry, it will constantly scan those for vulnerabilities. If you also have your containers running in your cluster, it will scan those as well. One of my best practices is to use tools like Trivy in my pipelines as well. So we can sort of run the Docker container version inside a pipeline, and then we can scan our container as we're building it before we even push it to a container registry. So you're sort of eliminating the potential issue of deploying a bad container. Like in some of my pipelines, I use Trivy, and I say if there's any critical CVEs, do not push it to my container registry. Or if it's a medium, then that's fine, we can handle that. But if it's a critical one, stop the pipeline, fail it, give me a report as to why. So that's what we do. So Trivy I really like it. They used to have a Windows version, back in the day, and it disappeared, and I have no idea where it's gone. I keep telling them bring it back because I don't want to keep switching to WSL2. I want to use my Windows thing and VS Code and stuff like that. But yeah, hopefully it'll come back at one point.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And on the topic of GitHub, Trevi, I think Trevi do have a GitHub action as well on their repository, so you can use. So I think it's a very, very recommended approach to use Trevi. So go ahead. I think cluster is created. We can move forward.
Yeah, so cool. If I go to the resource now, we can see the cluster here up and running. It's using 124.10 Kubernetes version. It's in UK South, and we can click on workloads, and we should see all of our pods running. So this is another cool feature I like in Azure is I don't need to log into the cluster to see everything. I can just go to the Azure portal, and as long as I'm part of that Azure AD group that I created, then I can see all of these pods and deployments and just see everything in its current state, which is really, really nice to see. You know, we can even see services and ingresses. You can even see secrets in here, which sometimes people don't like, but you can actually see the secrets. We can click on like this one here. You got the base 64. We can click on that and it will unencrypt it for you as well, which is really nice. So when you're doing basic troubleshooting and you're new to Kubernetes, this is definitely a good place to go. And you can lock it down via the Azure role-based access control. So I could give, say you were a colleague of mine, I could give you reader access. You could go read all of this, but you can't make any changes, because what is really cool is you can actually go and view the YAML and make changes to the YAML. And then I could like change that to a 2, and then I could do review and save. And I could actually save that in and push that to the cluster from the Azure portal as well. But we don't do that in production, only in dev test. When you're testing something, is all good. But we mentioned Kida before as well, and all of these pods are running, but they're not scaling at all. We have no view here to see horizontal pod autoscaler, which is built into Kubernetes and stuff like that. And with Azure, it's never just a Kubernetes cluster you have. You usually have other external sources like a database, service bus, RabbitMQ, table storage, Kafka maybe, and stuff like that. And sometimes you want to scale your workload based off of these external metrics. And Kubernetes can't really do that out of the box with the HPA. It's getting better at it, but it's not there yet, which is where Kida was born. And Kida is amazing. It's the Kubernetes event-driven autoscaler. So if you've got all these applications and you want to scale based off of these external metrics, this is the tool to use. It's part of the CNCF, and it's currently going through its process to be graduated. So like the final stage of the process, which you know all about as your got an incubating project, I think it is, or was it sandboxing? I can't remember.
Yes, so it's I am the work project I'm working on is in a parallel is a sandbox currently, but now graduate as you're absolutely correct. In the recent tweet, you go to the Keda's web's Twitter handle, their tweet saying we are starting the process of graduation. So it's a good news for the community as well.
Yeah, definitely, and it gives that sort of good feeling to the engineers who are using the Kida software to know, right, it is backed by the CNCF and it is at a graduating phase. So that means this software is here to stay. So that gives me more positive feeling to use it, even though I've used it since pre-beta because I love it that much. But with this, you get these scalar objects, and these scalars, there are lots of them, and even AWS scalars. You know, we've got Azure ones. This one here, Azure Pipelines, is actually my favorite scalar because I use Azure DevOps a lot to do all my builds, and I don't like to use the Microsoft hosted agents because I want to keep my clusters secure and locked down to who can access it. So what I do is I run my DevOps agents inside the cluster on a dedicated node pool, and then I use Kida to monitor my Azure DevOps queue and then add extra jobs to my cluster when there's a 1, 2, 3 in the queue, and it would just keep going through. So it's really cool, and I couldn't have done that without Kida. So this is probably my favorite one, and it's maintained by Microsoft, so you know it's good as well. You've got community maintained ones like Cassandra. Yeah, it's just really, really good. And with AKS, you can either install the version of Kida from the actual website using the Helm chart. So we've got like deploying Kida options here. You can just do Helm repo add and then update, and then just create a namespace called Kida and then install it. but you need to make sure your cluster is running 124 or higher if you're doing this method, because they've made some changes and it won't work with the old one. So that's a really good method to use. But again, you have to look after and control this version of it. So every time they do an update, you need to be monitoring the Git repo to get an alert to say, we just released a new version. And then you go and check it against your cluster. Can I update it? And then you do the updates. Potentially there might be issues, so you then need to go troubleshoot it. But you need to be the one to initiate that update on your cluster. The amount of times I've seen people put an old version on and forget about it because they've got other things to worry about, like developing their code and making it more robust, scalable. So it all gets left behind, which is where Azure have built this version of the KEDA add-on, which is currently in preview. And this sort of version is managed by Microsoft. So you know how earlier I said about the CSI driver, I just want to click a button and Microsoft manages it for me. That's what this does, but with KEDA. Now, this version is really good, except it's in preview. It's exactly the same version as KEDA, but not the most up-to-date version of KEDA. So here, for example, KEDA add-on installs version 2.7.0 of KEDA on your clusters, and we are currently on 2.10. So it's a few versions behind, but it is still in preview currently. So hopefully we'll see that updated soon. But another thing to note is if you are using the KEDA add-on, your cluster needs to be greater than or less than 125. So this one's good for anything less than that. If you're on so like if you're on 123, 124, or 122, 123, which you shouldn't be, then you can't use this newest version 2.10 anyway. So maybe use this version and keep your cluster at that. So these kind of nuances you need to be aware of and everything. But yeah, definitely go check out KEDA. It's very, very powerful, and it uses the HPA in the background. But you can do some crazy, crazy stuff with this. So yeah, definitely go check that out. And I've noticed you've put up the KubeCon 2023 link, and I'm super excited for KubeCon. I've noticed you're super excited because you have the background, and I think we're going to find out a lot more about AKS and KEDA and some awesome projects at KubeCon. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. You know, that's KEDA, and definitely look at using it in your cluster. Make sure you get that foundation right 100% before you even start putting your application onto it. Because with Kubernetes, yes, it's meant to be ephemeral. You're meant to be able to bin your cluster off and rebuild a new one. But we all know not everyone does that. And it's more, your clusters become more like the old Hyper-V virtual VMware machines, or your clusters where you never want to get rid of them. You always want to keep them nice and like your pets. Whereas really an AKS cluster should be seen as like the pod's ephemeral. You should be able to delete it and create a new one whenever you need to, and then just reroute your DNS through like Traffic Manager or Front Door or something like that. But yeah, and then I guess that's probably onto my last slide, which should be any questions, and hopefully my animations work because I should have some moving clouds, which is working, so that's good.
Yes. Great, absolutely. I think for the question for the audience, we'd address most of them, but 1, 2, 3, 4 more question. Like I think the KEDA is one of the most popular tool, and one of the favorite tool for myself as well, because you are into the situation when you suddenly see a spike or breaking in your clusters, and you want to do some incident management. Plus, if you can integrate KEDA with Prometheus.
Yes.
And you can scrape the matrix from the Prometheus, and based of those matrix, you can decide like, now the CPU and the memory is actually quite low for me. It's a perfect time to get a new pod or a new node up and running for myself. And then not just for scaling horizontally, but also shut down the instance, because these are the paid services in the cloud. You don't want to be stay steady and give you costing a lot of money. So that's where KEDA plus Prometheus is a brave new world. Plus, if you combine a policy engines with these three tools, this is a whole new world. And with the magic of Kubernetes, I think that's the best way for an engineer as well. So before we're wrapping up today's discussion, if there are few other projects in the cloud native ecosystem that are very famous. So let's just talk about one of them, that is GitOps. and to end the conversation today. So GitOps, if somebody using the GitOps on Azure, we
Yep.
know there is a Rancher fleet, there is a Flux,
Yep.
Argo CD. So which one is actually available in the in Azure, and which
So,
one is recommended?
so Azure can run any because it's just Kubernetes, but we have the cluster extension, which is like the add-ons, except you are more in control of when you want to update them. So the add-ons is one thing where Microsoft manages it, or cluster extensions are where you can manage the updates at your time and stuff like that. So they're sort of semi-managed. If there's a massive critical vulnerability, Microsoft will patch it for you. But this cluster extension uses Flux v2. So Microsoft has gone all in on Flux v2. They've also integrated into the Azure portal, which I think I might actually be able to show you if I bring my screen back up. If I just pop this one. Yep, there we go. So we actually have this GitOps section here, and this is using Flux under the hood. So from here, I can create this new deployment inside here, and I can give it configuration names. I can tell it what namespace, or if it's cluster wide, it's using Flux v2. This bit here sort of suggests maybe one day we might even see Argo come in as an option and let you pick which ones. I'm not sure yet, but it will be good to see because they're both as good as each other. But this is really good because Microsoft have created it natively into Azure. Flux doesn't have a GUI by default. There is one available via Weaveworks, but by default, Flux doesn't have one. Argo CD does, so it's a better demo. So you see a lot more people demoing Argo CD because it looks nicer. Like I did with the Azure portal, it's nicer to look at the portal than just a load of code, and that's what you get with Flux. But they basically do the same thing. I prefer Flux because it's built in and I have to do less management. Argo CD is absolutely fine. I've not done much with the Rancher stuff, to be honest with you, so I can't really comment on that. But if you're in AKS and only in AKS and Azure, just use the built-in option. If you're multi-tenanted, multi-cloud, then maybe use whichever one you're more comfortable with because AKS can support either.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. I think yes, for the Flux one, it's use a lot of makes sense because Flux is also the adopted tool in GitLab. Yes, I think
Yeah,
GitLab
GitLab.
as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think absolutely. So there is a service available for you if you are the Flux oriented, and Flux is also graduating to V2 GA. Flux is now becoming a GA tool. So this means a lot of adoption as well. But now you have a service for the GitOps. If you need GitOps, you have something. And in future, might see Argo CD and other tools popping up, but it's been there for you. So now we're wrapping up the discussion today. So it's been a wonderful walkthrough because if your container created click, 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 and you doesn't know what's happening behind the scene, this is the episode to watch for because Richard has covered a great mouthful concept today is on this episode. What happening behind the scene? Because once you watch this episode, your troubleshooting is very, very easier and nicer. And you don't see it jump into the other Stack Overflow question for to wonder so what's figure out happening there. But now we will be wrapping up. But there is another episode with Richard after the KubeCon of his experience of talking to other MVPs with the Azure community, with the Cloud Native community, and he will suggest us what is the next wave coming up in Azure and where his community is heading up to. So we might have one more guest, but Richard is absolutely booked after the KubeCon for this on this show as well. So Richard, any final thoughts plus on your book? If people wanted to get your book, where they go and what is in the book?
Yeah, so the book, I've got a copy here, Azure Containers Explained. So it's all about when you should use what technology in Azure to run your containers. So it's more like a scenario based. We give you a scenario, you're a small business or you're a startup, you've got one container, which technology in Azure should you use? And we sort of break down the pros, the cons, sort of show you how you could potentially do it with a sample application we built, which is like a billing API. And it's just sort of to fill that gap, whereas people always think, oh, I've got a container, I need to go straight to AKS. That's not always the case. You know, you could run your container in Azure Functions. You can run it in web apps. You can run it in Azure Container instances. You can run it in Azure Container apps. And we cover all of that inside this. At some point you might even run it in a virtual machine if you really wanted to. So we cover all of that kind of base here. And definitely please check it out. Azure Containers Explained, and hopefully you find it as helpful as we did writing it. And it's a book I wish I had when I first started with containers in Azure. So hopefully what we've created will help other people.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you very much for the comments. Sajid is saying thank you both for the great this session, and thank you very much, Sajid, for being tuning into the channel as well. So definitely highly recommend for anyone who is actually watching us today. There is the book link for the book. You go to this link, and there is link direct them to you can purchase and watch it on reading. More Azure is on the pixelreport.co.uk. It's a very wonderful resource, and Aurea and Richard always share new updates, new version updates. So it's been a bookmark. It's recommended for me to bookmark this link. If you've been to the Azure, you can subscribe to this channel if you like to. This is the Twitter handle of this podcast. And KubeCon, most of us traveling. Richard is there. You can grab his book from, might be he can give away some books as well. Who don't know?
See what I can do.
Yes,
I'll speak to the publisher and see what we can do.
Yes, absolutely. And there is a Kubernetes event for the art of scaling that we learn. So let me wrap up the episode and then we go from today. So I think today you learn a scenario of taking an existing application and migrating over to the use a cloud native approach in order to take advantage of increased scalability and higher level services. You look how different various services around GitOps, Azure Defender apps, or container apps, or Azure Container instance, and some of the services like KDA for the autoscaling and HPA or horizontal parts autoscaler or vertical parts autoscaler. But we will be wrapping again this today. But we'll be meeting again after the KubeCon with Richard with some more interesting news to share with you. So thank you very much for tuning into this episode and joining us today. We'll be back again after some time. Bye bye. Stay safe, stay healthy. And thank you very much, Richard, for being on the show.
All right. Thank you.